Thank you for joining me for another sets of conversation. This is the first video that I'm doing under the Health Roundup rebranded, and this is about the perennial doctor strike. There is a problem, and I think it's a moment for us to acknowledge that as a country we have a problem that is in Kenya, and if that problem exists, the question we need to be asking ourselves: how do we solve for it? What actions do we need to take to ensure that we sort the mess in the healthcare sector, to ensure that we are always guaranteed that some of the social services will never be at risk. And one of the most critical ones is healthcare, and that is what I'm going to talk about. But then let's roll up a bit. Before we talk about what we need to do, where we need to do it, and how we need to do it, we need to ask ourselves, where did the journey begin? How did we get here? Pre-colonial and post-colonial era, we had healthcare service delivery mostly and predominantly by the government. And that was the mainstay. In the sense that if David was unwell, he knew that he would go to a hospital, and the hospital would be guaranteed by the government with government doctors, government physicians, government clinicians who would be able to offer healthcare services to David who needed it. That is looking at it in the conventional model of healthcare delivery, which is looking at modern medicine. That was a standard practice. Moving forward, the government investment in healthcare kept going down, and with the government healthcare service delivery and investment in infrastructural development and whatever was needed, it meant that as a country, we did not have sufficient healthcare facilities and sufficient number of doctors in the right facilities with closer access proximity to the people who needed those services. Then this created an avenue for the private investors and private physicians and clinicians to set up their own private practices. The main aspect being the public needed healthcare services. The government was not investing in those areas where the services were needed, and therefore then, as a private individual, somebody was considering and looking at it, how can I practice and deliver my skills and my services to a community that needed healthcare services? And as I'm delivering these healthcare services, the patients are able to get the services they need, they're able to get the medicine they need, the lab services, whatever kind of medical intervention that was needed in that ecosystem. And if so, then I would be able to charge a fee for this particular service that then would ensure that my practice and my operations are sustainable. That brought the aspect where we now have private sector component of healthcare service delivery. So that then gave us the option where we had public healthcare sector, private healthcare sector. 60 to 40 thereabout in the current domain, with the private sector having grown substantially over the last period and the last couple of years as we're moving forward. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? I would say the question is people are getting what they need, and therefore both players playing are closing a gap that exists in our market that needs to be addressed. But where does that link us with the current strikes that we're talking about, which is becoming a problem? The masses in the market might not be able to access private healthcare services, looking at the cost factor, looking at the abilities and all that, which is still a risk. But also when you look at the private facilities, they're not as prevalent or as widespread in the very local communities where they're needed. So some of the spaces, the people are still dependent on government healthcare services, which then poses a risk to that mother in the local village in Siaya where I come from, who might not be able to go to Siaya District Hospital or rather Siaya County Referral Hospital and get the services. Reason being, doctors are on strike. That is a problem. But then, as much as it is a problem as well on that level, looking at the background of it, we're looking at it from a government perspective. Social services are a responsibility of the government. And in our constitution, it's also inscribed in it that the role of delivering access to quality healthcare services is on the government. The mechanism that governments employ to deliver on these vary across the world. And this is because there are certain markets where the government has a responsibility, and with that responsibility then they either contract private players to offer the healthcare services at a fee paid for by the government. Therefore, service delivery is a role of the private sector, but financing of that component is part of the government responsibility. And the reason for the social services being a responsibility of the government is to ensure that across the continent we have people with different capabilities, different financial means and socioeconomic status. Then it means the government being mandated to safeguard and look out for the interests of the public is able to guarantee that if David doesn't have a pay, David is not able to finance his own needs, but healthcare services will be guaranteed because that is my provision in ensuring they have access to it. And these are services that are financed by the government taxes that are levied on people and individuals wherever they are, both from goods and services that we are procuring to the salaries that are being taxed and all that. The taxes will finance healthcare services, including the voluntary social health insurance schemes that governments do run. So that is where the private sector offering services, the government is paying for them. On the other end is where government invests in infrastructure. And when the government invests in infrastructure, they also have to employ their healthcare workers, they have to finance it and ensure that service delivery runs unimpeded across the cycle. Because those are facilities where government has ultimate responsibility 100%. That is a component that is still working in part of the country and to a greater extent the public sector. Unfortunately, that is currently facing lots of challenges, and that is where we need to intervene and see what needs to happen and where does it need to happen. And in a recent conversation and in a paper that I did a while back, I noted that governments have been given a lot of responsibility, and it is us as the people who have given them so much power. Why do I say that? The role of a government is to govern and to guarantee access to social services that the public are entitled to as per the constitutional provisions. Then when we talk about governing, it's about setting up legislative and regulatory frameworks that would guarantee that the person who needs a service will get that service. Do we have that happening? To an extent, yes, which is commendable. But at the same time, when we convolute the responsibilities and the scope of mandate to include execution, then that is a problem. We all engage and work with companies, and I've seen organizations all over the world where we have an advisory board, we have a strategic board, we have an executional arm. Therefore then, the role of the advisory or the strategic governance, legislative and all that, is to set up the blueprint, to set up the structure of what good looks like. And therefore with that framework in place, it is the role of the executive arm to execute, to deliver on what needs to happen. How have we messed up these two? We've gotten to a point where the same stakeholders within the government architecture who are mandated to set up the standards, the regulatory frameworks and all that, are the same people mandated to execute on them to ensure they deliver on the same. What happens when I'm not able to deliver on what standards are set? I dilute the standards. After diluting the standards, then it gets to a point where the services that I'm offering do not meet the standard that I already diluted. The ultimate person who suffers, the ultimate victim is the public, is the general populace who are counting on those services to be available to them, which is a risk. Currently, when we talk about the doctor strike, in 2017, I was in my university education in my third, fourth year of schooling, and the doctor strike happened. It had its own fair share of problems because I could not continue with my electives. That was a challenge. Then when we went back to school and graduated in 2019, we had to wait for 4-5 months before getting to start our internship. Now we are in a situation where the posting is becoming a challenge. It is a problem, and it is a problem that needs to be solved. Solving it does not mean that we need to say the government has to do this. It doesn't mean the KMPDU has to compromise on what the government wants or rather is asking for. We have to be objective and say it says a negotiation, and negotiation means then it is what are we going for, what do we need. But also at the core of it, and I remember last week I watched a video that was talking about, before we get to a point of taking hard stances, can we ask ourselves what is the ultimate aspiration that we all have? We all have an aspiration of ensuring that as a public we have access to quality healthcare services. I'd guarantee you there's no quality healthcare services without doctors. There's no quality healthcare services without medical supplies and products. And there is no quality healthcare services without the right facilities and equipment within a hospital setting that are able to deliver those services. Those are not feasible. But when we look at it from the healthcare workforce component, unless the doctors are optimally trained and engaged and motivated enough, they'll not be able to deliver the quality healthcare services. We've had narratives and conversations around absentee doctors and absentee healthcare workers. Are these true or not? Some of the cases, they are actual cases that will be noted. The question is, what pushes them to that extra aspect of having to go to seek service, to offer their services in private settings? Some of the cases that I've seen, and I've had conversation with some of my colleagues within the public sector, where somebody goes for 3 months without a pay. even a single shilling. This is a person who is a parent, who is a cousin or a nephew or whatever, with their personal responsibilities to run their homes and their families. They have responsibilities to pay school fees for their kids. They have responsibilities to meet their other obligations which have financial implications on them. 3 months down the line, you've not gotten your salary and you're being told, bear on, keep on offering services. There is the hypocritical oath that we take as doctors. But unless I'm able to meet my needs, the Maslow's hierarchy states physiological needs come first. I would want to serve and I commit to serve. That is a personal commitment. But if I'm not able to eat, being able to serve you better will not work. Therefore, we need to do better. And doing better then means we need to move from a point of acknowledging that, one, the doctors who have been trained, who are not being posted as interns, these people were recruited admitted into the universities where they did their courses. They met the government provisions in their second year of schooling. And I remember my second year of schooling, I was pre-licensed as an upcoming pharmacist to be in the market. Therefore, then the government had that provision. So if we're being told that at the current moment the government does not have the funding, how honest is that if they really did budget for the number of students who are graduating? Because the number was known 3-4 years ago. That is not a fact that we need to lie about. It's something that we need to take with the utmost seriousness that it serves, and we need to look at it in a better way. The next bit that we need to see is that getting the doctors employed, getting them into the facilities and meeting those demands only will not solve the problem. This is a bigger problem, and it is a bigger problem that as a society we've taken a step back. We have become apathetic to the level that we do not speak the truth to the people who need to hear what we feel, and we are also not holding our leaders accountable. It's now 2 months, 54 days or thereabout since the doctor strike started. The public, we're talking in social media. Social media does not solve problems. How are we getting to engage with our leaders to hold them really accountable and tell them whatever it is that we're dealing with, it is not fair? A mother having to travel between 3 hospitals because they're looking for a doctor who is not available because the government has not hit their mandate and their responsibility to employ the doctors and to pay them their salaries as due. That is not fair. That is not a laughing matter. People are dying and we cannot play games with that. We have to get to a point where we hold our leaders accountable. We are boldening them by not holding them accountable, not speaking up where we need to speak up, and not guaranteeing that healthcare services are made available to them. Solving this problem is a long-term thing, and we need to look at the wholesome architecture of our healthcare sector. There are conversations about the social health insurance fund that will only pay for the healthcare services that have been delivered. The question is, how is it even being structured to work? And we told conversation that it should be paying the doctors. It will not pay the doctors. Insurance is to cater for healthcare services. In the public sector, that would be catering for the services that are needed, and the government would still ultimately, through the exchequer, pay the salaries. Maybe in the private sector, if we move to the model that I mentioned where the private sector runs the healthcare service delivery wholesomely, then the government pays for the healthcare services. That is the model that we have in the United States of America. Is it an ideal system? I don't think so, because the cost of that care would be above the roof, and maybe most of our people will never be able to afford those services. We need to look at that. My proposition is that we need to push for the establishment of a health service commission, number 1. 2, we need a level of honesty and sobriety in terms of dealing with healthcare service delivery and healthcare workers in this country. There's no point where a government should have mediocre approaches in addressing healthcare services and healthcare needs, which is a social healthcare need, and that is why, as members of the public, we pay taxes because we entrust the government to take care of our social needs, including the people who are not able to pay for these, because that is the social safety net that they need for us. How are we doing it? What are we doing about it? It's time that we got mad enough to be able to call the government to account, and as the public, we need to hold each other accountable and to ask for better, because we deserve better. When the doctors are on the streets, are we joining them? Are we walking with them this journey? And in the same moment, are we calling the private sector players to hold them accountable and say, if the government does not work, as a private sector, I'll do my fair share. But to what extent that puts the risk to the people in the community? Because not everybody might afford my services in a private healthcare clinic. We need to do better. I'm calling on each of us to do our fair share, to hold each other accountable, and ensure that we do not get to such a level and not getting to such a level needs a structured framework and institutionalized approach, and that is why Health Service Commission would be a solution. And it is a solution if our respective stakeholders and organizations and agencies who are mandated to deal with these issues are doing their fair share. The Human Resources for Health Advisory Committee in the country is existing. To what extent are they advising the government? To what extent are they engaging with the union to ensure that all these issues do not fester and continue becoming a problem to the country? If that doesn't happen, we'll still keep dancing to the tune of problems and people dying in hospitals, but there's nothing we can do about it. Why? Because we've given up. And we're giving up because we've selected and actually selectively chosen to go by our own selfish interest or our own aspirations and desires at the primal level. Maybe I'll be able to afford my healthcare services and my bills. How about the next person next to me? How about my neighbor who might not be able to? We need to do better. And it may call to you, when we talk about health matters and what it means for us, it means for us that we need to walk this journey together. Universal healthcare coverage is only universal when everybody has access to healthcare services and when all of us collaboratively and collectively do what needs to be done, call for better, and do what's better for the country. Thank you so much, and I hope this conversation pushes you and nudges you a little bit further to ensure that we are able to meet our obligations, to meet the needs of our people, to ensure that every single individual in every part of the country has access to healthcare services that they need. Thank you so much, and have a good one.